They thought the 3-year-old girl was too little to speak, too hurt to remember. But when she pointed across the courtroom and whispered, "He made Mommy fall," the entire room fell silent. Beside her sat a German shepherd named Moose, not barking, not growling, just listening, and what he heard uncovered a truth long buried. Lies, cover-ups, a plan unraveled not by lawyers, but by crayon sketches and the unbreakable bond between a child and her dog, one that forced the courtroom to shift and the truth to finally come into the light. A heavy mist lingered over Montpelier, Vermont, that morning, the kind that clung to brick and bone and made every breath feel like it belonged to winter. The state courthouse stood at the edge of Capitol Street like a stone sentinel, its broad steps glazed with frost, its windows fogged by the breath of anticipation. Inside, the courtroom was unusually still, filled with that tense, respectful quiet that only exists when everyone present knows something delicate is about to happen. There was no rustle of papers, no shifting of coats, just the muffled hum of heating vents and the ticking of an antique clock above the judge's bench. At the far end of the room sat Judge Marjorie Bennett, a woman in her late 60s, tall and lean with silver hair pulled into a disciplined bun. Known throughout the state for her unwavering fairness and tempered compassion, Judge Bennett had once been a family attorney before rising through the judicial ranks. Years ago, she had lost her only son in a car accident, a pain that never left her eyes, though she rarely spoke of it. That loss had carved into her a deep well of empathy, which now shaped every ruling she made involving children. Across the aisle sat Rachel Quinn, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher with soft features, earth-toned clothing, and the kind of gentle presence that could quiet even the most restless classroom. She was not a mother herself, but when her older sister Melissa Carter fell into a coma after a brutal domestic attack, Rachel didn't hesitate to step in. Hazel and Ivy, Melissa's 3-year-old twin daughters, had been found at the scene, curled up under the kitchen table, silent, their eyes wide and blank. Since then, Rachel had been their temporary guardian, doing her best to soothe children who would not speak, not even to her. Hazel and Ivy entered the courtroom hand in hand. They were identical in the way only twins can be, both with soft brown curls tied in fraying ribbons and cheeks still round with babyhood. Hazel, the slightly taller one, held her gaze low to the floor. Ivy walked with a crumpled bunny pressed to her chest, one ear nearly detached. Neither girl looked toward the judge, the jury, or the attorneys. They were flanked by Daniel Ruiz, a 29-year-old assistant district attorney fresh out of New York and fresh-faced enough to be underestimated. But Daniel's calm voice and keen instincts had already earned respect in the Montpelier legal circuit. Today, though, his confidence was quieter, more fragile. He had spent weeks preparing for this hearing, researching child psychology, coordinating trauma experts, drafting motions, yet nothing he had read could quite prepare him for two children who had seen the worst night of their lives and refused to say a word. Trailing a few steps behind the girls came Moose, a 5-year-old German shepherd trained as a court therapy dog. His black and tan coat shone under the fluorescent lights, and his gait was calm, measured, protective. Moose had a scar above his right eye from a fall during his early canine training, and though he had been meant for police work, his quiet demeanor made him a perfect candidate for child trauma support. Moose had worked with over a dozen children in his career, but today, something in his posture suggested he sensed this was different. When the girls reached the front of the courtroom, Rachel crouched to whisper something, but neither child responded. They stopped in place, their small bodies stiff with unease. Ivy's hand began to tremble. Then Moose stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and lay down at their feet, his head resting gently between his paws, ears alert but relaxed. Hazel looked at him first, then Ivy. Without being asked, Ivy knelt down beside the dog, burying her face into the thick fur along his shoulder. Hazel followed. For a full 10 seconds, the room held its breath. Even Judge Bennett leaned forward. Ivy's fingers moved gently, twisting a clump of Moose's fur. Hazel pressed her cheek against his chest. And then, Ivy whispered. It was so soft that no one but Moose could hear it. Her lips moved slightly, no more than a breath, but something shifted. Hazel lifted her head and looked straight ahead, not at the people, not at the ceiling, but at something unspoken between memory and courage. Moose remained perfectly still, his dark eyes calm, steady. Then Hazel whispered something too. The courtroom remained frozen in its quiet. No cameras were allowed today, only handwritten notes and memory. Daniel Ruiz shifted in his seat, unsure whether to stand or let the moment bloom on its own. Rachel didn't dare speak. Judge Bennett, whose hands had been folded neatly before her, now gripped the edge of her bench. Hazel's voice rose just slightly, no louder than a sigh. "He made Mommy fall." The words hung in the air like smoke. Rachel's breath caught. Daniel stood halfway. "Ivy," he said gently, "can you tell me where you were when that happened?" The little girl said nothing. Instead, she pulled from the pocket of her coat a folded piece of paper and held it out toward Moose. Moose didn't move. Hazel took the drawing and, with slow, hesitant steps, handed it to Rachel. Rachel unfolded it, her hands shaking slightly. The drawing was crude, a child's vision in waxy crayon, a brown table snapped in two, red lines scattered around it, and two small blue stick figures under the table, curled up. Above them, a figure with jagged lines for arms stood next to a fallen woman. Daniel approached slowly. "May I?" Rachel nodded and handed him the drawing. He held it up for the judge. "This was drawn last night," he said softly. "No one prompted her. No adult helped. But the details match what we found at the scene." Judge Bennett studied the image for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted back to the girls, who still sat beside Moose. Ivy's hand rested on his back, moving up and down in slow rhythm. Hazel looked up, her expression blank, but no longer afraid. Judge Bennett cleared her throat. "Let the record reflect that the minors have spoken voluntarily. Their drawings and verbal responses will be entered into preliminary evidence." No one cheered. No one moved. Daniel finally exhaled. Rachel closed her eyes for a second. Moose remained as still as ever, a living bridge between memory and voice. The day after Hazel and Ivy first spoke in court, the air in Montpelier seemed changed. The snow still crusted along the courthouse steps, but the silence inside the courtroom now carried something heavier than frost anticipation. As people filed in, their movements were more careful, more reverent, as if afraid to disturb something fragile and unseen. No one forgot what the twins had whispered, and certainly no one forgot the dog who had made them whisper. Hazel and Ivy sat once again beside Moose on a low, cushioned bench near the witness box. The German shepherd's broad shoulders shifted as he adjusted his position, settling more firmly against the girls. His amber eyes scanned the room, not out of suspicion, but something more primal, more protective. Moose wasn't just there for comfort. Today, he was a wall. Rachel Quinn sat a few feet behind them. Though she looked composed, her fingers twisted the silver ring she wore on her thumb, a nervous habit she thought she had long outgrown. She hadn't slept much, haunted by the drawing Ivy had given the day before, the figure with jagged arms, the table cracked in two, the red scribbles that spoke louder than any scream. She kept the drawing in her bag now, as if it might crumble if left alone. The girls hadn't said much at home either, but this morning, before breakfast, Ivy had patted Moose's head and whispered, "He hears me even when I dream." Across the courtroom, Daniel Ruiz stood ready. He wore the same navy suit as yesterday, but today there was a quiet fire beneath the calm. Last night, he had spent hours going through old witness lists, including one name that now gnawed at his gut: Sam Tucker, a mechanic in his early 40s, with a thin build and restless hands. Sam had testified weeks earlier that he'd seen Melissa trip over her own feet, he'd claimed. But something about that testimony never sat right. And now, in light of Hazel's words, Daniel was ready to press. Just as the proceedings began, the side door creaked open and Sam Tucker entered. He looked out of place in a Courthouse 2 casual, in a faded denim jacket and scuffed boots, his sandy hair slicked back unevenly. His jaw twitched when he saw the twins, and he avoided looking at the prosecution table entirely. Judge Bennett, from her bench, made a note. "We'll be revisiting Mr. Tucker's statement shortly," she said calmly, her voice as measured as always. But first, Daniel moved forward. "Your Honor," he said, "we'd like to submit a second drawing into the record." Rachel stepped forward and handed over the newest picture. This one had come from Hazel, handed to her that morning without a word. It showed the same scene, the kitchen, the cracked table, but now there was something more. A stick figure in red hovered near the twins, towering over them, while another smaller figure in gray stood at the edge of the drawing, almost as if watching. Daniel held it up. "This figure," he said, pointing, "matches the description Hazel gave this morning to her therapist. It wasn't their mother who was standing. It was Craig Dalton." There was a murmur from the gallery. Craig sat motionless at the defense table, his lips pressed into a hard line. As if sensing the tension, Moose shifted again. Hazel leaned against his side. Ivy, meanwhile, reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another folded paper. She didn't look up, didn't speak. She simply handed it to Rachel. Daniel hesitated, but Judge Bennett gave a slight nod. "Let's hear it," she said. The drawing was simple. 2 stick girls, each with a heart drawn on their chest, hiding under a blue line labeled table. A figure in black loomed above them. The words below, in a shaky crayon scrawl, read, "He yelled like thunder." Mommy cried. Rachel swallowed and looked toward Daniel. It was all too real. "Ms. Quinn," Judge Bennett said gently, "you mentioned earlier that the girls haven't spoken to anyone other than the dog. Have they been in therapy?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rachel replied. "We've had child therapists come by 3 times a week, but they never opened up until Moose arrived." Judge Bennett nodded slowly, as if weighing more than just legal precedent. "Very well." It was time to confront Sam Tucker. Daniel requested a recess to speak with him privately, and the court allowed it. They moved to a side chamber, where Sam sat across from Daniel and Rachel, shifting in his chair, his fingers fidgeting with a key ring. "You gave sworn testimony that Melissa Carter fell on her own," Daniel began. "I need to ask again. Did you see her fall?" Sam hesitated. His eyes darted to the floor, then to Rachel, then away again. I saw her on the ground," he said. "She looked bad." "But did you see it happen?" I told you what I saw." "Did Craig Dalton pay you to say that?" The room froze. Even Rachel stopped breathing. Sam's shoulders tightened. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he muttered. "He said it was just to get custody of the kids, not—" He didn't finish. The silence that followed was answer enough. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Bennett addressed the jury. "It appears prior testimony may have been influenced by outside parties. We'll consider this carefully. For now, we will resume with the primary witnesses." Hazel and Ivy remained on the bench, and Moose remained at their side. At one point, Hazel looked up and whispered something. Ivy giggled, a small, breathy sound that made Rachel's chest tighten. It had been so long since either of them laughed. Daniel walked slowly toward the bench. "Hazel," he said softly, kneeling to her level. "Do you remember what happened that night?" She didn't respond. "Ivy?" he tried. Ivy leaned forward and whispered into Moose's ear. The dog tilted his head. Then Hazel said, "He scared Mommy." That was all, but it was enough to crack the silence wide open. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Rachel Quinn's small kitchen, catching the dust in the air and illuminating the drawings spread across the table. Rachel stood silently, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in her hand, her eyes locked on the jagged red lines scrawled across a sheet of white paper. Hazel had handed it to her without a word, sliding it into her lap while Rachel helped Ivy into her coat. Now, in the stillness of the kitchen, the drawing screamed. A broken rectangle, a table, clearly stood at the center, one side cracked open in uneven angles. Next to it, a stick figure lay on its side, surrounded by scattered shapes marked with X. In the corner, two small figures huddled beneath a line labeled blanket. What chilled Rachel wasn't just the image, it was the presence of labels. Neither Hazel nor Ivy had ever written words in their drawings before. She laid the picture beside others, comparing them. One from Ivy last week showed what she'd thought was abstract color-red lines, blue scribbles, a jagged black shape. Now, in context, she saw it. A lamp exploding, a scream illustrated not by a mouth, but by a spray of red extending from a round head. Each image was beginning to form a sequence, a story. Rachel ran a hand through her short copper hair, her eyes tired behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had always been quiet, practical, the type of teacher who preferred laminated lesson plans and structured routines. But this was a kind of chaos she had no training for. That afternoon, in Daniel Ruiz's office at the courthouse, the two sat together going over the drawings. Daniel had cleared his desk, pushed aside files, and replaced the overhead lights with a small desk lamp, casting the room in warmer tones. "These aren't random," Rachel said, laying each drawing in order. "They follow the same narrative." Daniel nodded, his sleeves rolled up, exposing ink stains along his wrist from a pen that had exploded earlier that morning. "They don't know the police report. They haven't seen any photos." He picked up the newest drawing and examined the blue smudge under the table. "This is consistent with the blood splatter pattern the crime scene investigators found. These girls, they remember." As they reviewed the artwork, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced down, frowned, then stood. "I need to step out for a minute. There's someone I want you to meet." When he returned, he brought with him a woman in her early 40s, tall and composed, wearing a gray wool coat and black leather gloves. Her dark hair was twisted into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and a thin scar crossed the left side of her upper lip. "This is Dr. Evelyn Harrow," Daniel introduced. "Child psychologist. She specializes in nonverbal trauma expression." Evelyn nodded politely at Rachel, her voice low and calm. "I've reviewed the video footage from the first hearing. Your girls are showing patterns we see in children who've experienced complex trauma. Their use of drawing, labeling, sequence, it's rare at this age. It suggests the memories are intact, but sealed behind a wall of silence." She paused, then looked at Rachel. "And the dog, they trust him more than any adult in the room." Rachel gave a faint smile. "That's Moose for you." Back in court the next day, the drawings were submitted into evidence, one by one, laid on the projector for the jury to see. Moose lay curled at Hazel and Ivy's feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes watchful. When Hazel became visibly tense as her drawing was displayed, Moose shifted slightly, pressing his body against her leg. Ivy, sensing her sister's distress, reached over and slipped her small hand into Hazel's. The room, already quiet, went still. Daniel approached the witness stand with careful steps. "Members of the jury," he began, "these images were created by two children under no prompting, no instruction, and without any knowledge of what others have testified. Yet each drawing matches specific details found in the crime scene report. The broken table, the shattered glass, the position of the victims, and the presence of the accused." The defense attorney, a woman named Linda Fay, rose. Linda was in her late 50s, with a sharp jawline and eyes that missed nothing. She'd built her career defending high-risk clients, and her reputation for cold logic was unmatched. "Objection, Your Honor," she said coolly. "These are crayon drawings from toddlers. They're not admissible as factual evidence." Judge Marjorie Bennett turned toward Linda. "They are not presented as definitive proof, but as part of a broader behavioral and emotional testimony. The court will allow them." Linda sat, her expression unreadable. Outside the courtroom during a recess, Daniel found himself pacing in the hallway when a figure approached from the far end. Detective Miles Weaver, late 30s, tall with a wide build and a nose that had clearly been broken more than once, handed him a slim file. "We pulled Tucker's financials like you asked," he said gruffly. "Looks like a deposit came in 2 days before his original testimony from a shell account in Nevada." Daniel opened the folder and skimmed the report. His jaw tightened. "Tied to Craig Dalton?" "Too early to say. But the name on the account traces back to a business partner of his, Martin Geller, real estate mostly." Rachel, who had stepped into the hallway just in time to hear this, paled. "He's the one who visited Melissa 2 weeks before the incident," she said. "Said he was there to check the property value. I thought it was strange at the time." Daniel folded the file. "We need to subpoena that connection." Back in the courtroom, the girls were quieter. Moose stayed close, his breath even and calm. Ivy leaned into his side, her eyes fluttering closed. She had not spoken since the drawing earlier that morning. Hazel, however, looked up suddenly and said, almost too softly to hear, "It happened at night," he yelled. "Then the lamp broke." Rachel closed her eyes. Another crack in the wall. Snow had begun to fall again in Montpelier, swirling in soft gusts that whispered against courthouse windows like a memory trying to return. Inside, the courtroom was warmer than usual, but the silence was heavy, pulled taut like a string stretched to its limits. The air felt expectant. Everyone knew something was coming, they just didn't know what shape it would take. Hazel and Ivy sat in their now familiar place beside Moose, who was curled beside them like a mountain with fur. The German shepherd's ears were up, alert, but his body was still. At 5 years old, Moose had a calmness that made people trust him instantly. His thick black and tan coat shimmered faintly under the courtroom lights, and his nose twitched slightly as if reading the room in a language only he understood. He seemed to know, in a way no one could explain, that today would matter. Rachel Quinn sat a few rows behind, clutching her canvas tote bag like a lifeline. Inside was the USB drive. It had arrived that morning from Dr. Evelyn Harrow, the psychologist Daniel had brought in the day before. The file contained an audio recording from a session conducted privately between the girls and Moose in Rachel's living room, captured with Evelyn's permission. The girls hadn't known they were being recorded. There were no prompts. Just them, a dog, and the lingering echoes of fear. Judge Marjorie Bennett sat straighter than usual. Her eyes flicked toward the prosecution bench where Daniel Ruiz stood, notes in hand, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Detective Miles Weaver, broad-shouldered and always slightly rumpled, nodded once. He had reviewed the audio, too. It had left even him 10 years homicide, 3 years special victims, sitting in his car for half an hour afterward, staring through the windshield at nothing. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "The prosecution requests permission to enter an audio recording as supplemental testimony." Judge Bennett looked up. "Is the source verified?" "It is, Your Honor. The session was conducted under the supervision of a licensed child psychologist. The children were not directed in any way." "Proceed." Rachel walked to the front and handed the USB to the court clerk, who loaded it onto the audio system. The speakers crackled softly. Then came Ivy's voice, barely more than a breath. "Shadow, you have to be quiet, okay? He might come back." A pause. "He got mad. Mommy cried. The lamp broke. It was loud. I was under the bed. You weren't there yet, but I wish you were." Another silence. Then Hazel. "Mommy told us to hide. I think she got hurt because she was trying to talk." A long stretch of quiet followed, and then, almost inaudible, the sound of Ivy whispering again. "I didn't cry. You'd be proud, right?" The recording ended. The courtroom was still. No movement, no coughs, no rustling of jackets. Even the stenographer's fingers hovered over her keys. Judge Bennett looked down, blinking slowly. "Admitted," she said. Daniel stood again. We also have visual evidence that correlates directly with the girl's statements. He signaled to Miles, who dimmed the lights and wheeled in a small monitor. On screen appeared a grainy video feed, time-stamped 9:47 p.m. The source? An outdoor security camera from the Carsons' Melissa Carter's neighbors. The camera had not been angled directly at the house, but enough audio had bled through to capture sounds from within. The video played. A loud crash. A woman's voice shouting, indistinct but urgent. Then a child's voice, small, fragile, unmistakable. "Moose! Hide!" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Daniel paused the footage and turned to the jury. That voice was recorded a full 2 weeks before Moose ever entered the children's lives. They didn't know him yet, but in the moment, they imagined him there. That's the level of trust they've built with this dog. And that's the kind of trauma we're dealing with. Defense attorney Linda Fay stood sharply. "Objection! This is emotionally manipulative and speculative." "Sustained," Judge Bennett said, though her voice was softer now. At that moment, Ivy shifted slightly. Her hand reached toward Moose, brushing his shoulder. Hazel whispered something to her sister that no one else could hear. Daniel turned to the court. "We request that Mr. Sam Tucker be recalled for further questioning." Minutes later, Sam Tucker entered again, looking smaller than the last time. His denim jacket had been replaced by a blazer too tight in the shoulders, and he walked with the unease of someone trying not to make noise. Daniel approached carefully. "Mr. Tucker, do you still stand by your original statement that you saw Melissa Carter fall on her own?" Sam looked down. His Adam's apple bobbed. "No," he said. "I was paid." The room went silent again. "By whom?" A beat. "Martin Geller," Sam said, his voice cracking. "He said it was just to keep Craig out of trouble. Said the girls would be fine. I didn't think it would go this far." Linda Fay stood again. "Your Honor." "Sit down," Judge Bennett said, firmer this time. Daniel walked to the edge of the jury box. "So you never saw her fall?" Sam nodded, ashamed. "I heard yelling. I looked out the window and saw her on the ground. That's all." Rachel pressed her hand to her chest. Ivy had drawn that moment, weeks ago. Melissa on the ground. A black figure in the window. Judge Bennett leaned back, her expression unreadable. "The court will schedule a follow-up hearing regarding the witness's false testimony." As everyone stood for recess, Rachel moved quickly to the bench. Moose looked up as she knelt beside Hazel and Ivy. "You girls did so well," she whispered. Hazel didn't respond. But Ivy leaned forward and said, "Moose heard it all." Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sweetie, he did." And now, so had everyone else. The wind in Montpelier had shifted. It didn't howl or scream. It whispered. Just as the town watched the courtroom unfold through headlines and murmurs, something else was unraveling. Quietly, but unmistakably. That morning, clouds hung low over the courthouse, casting the building in a soft gray veil. A fine mist clung to the sidewalks, turning every footstep into a hush. Inside, the trial had reached a new weight. It no longer felt like a case of testimony and evidence. It felt like a reckoning. Hazel and Ivy were dressed in matching gray sweaters and corduroy dresses, their hair brushed into tidy pigtails. They walked slowly, flanked by Rachel Quinn, who carried a tote bag that now felt like it contained their entire story drawings, documents, even small notes the girls had written on napkins at breakfast. Moose, as always, walked just behind them, not needing a leash. He didn't follow them. He guarded them. That morning, Judge Marjorie Bennett wore a navy robe with subtle embroidery along the cuffs, barely visible, but just enough to suggest a personal touch beneath her otherwise formal bearing. Her posture was as straight as always, but her eyes, behind thin rectangular glasses, lingered on the girls longer than usual. She had read every transcript, every word Hazel and Ivy had spoken to Moose, and each time she finished, she found herself blinking back, a stinging tightness in her throat. Today, the courtroom was full. A few community members, parents from Rachel's school, off-duty officers, even Melissa Carter's physical therapist Sharon Miles, a small woman with cropped silver hair and a calming presence, had quietly taken a seat in the back. Sharon had spent the last 6 weeks helping Melissa learn how to walk short distances again. Her presence now was quiet support, nothing more. Daniel Ruiz stepped to the center of the room. His voice, steady but low, filled the space without rising. "Your Honor, we respectfully request to present financial records newly acquired from the Vermont State Bureau of Investigation." He turned to the screen behind him as a document appeared, a bank transfer, dated 2 days after the incident. The accused, Craig Dalton, received a wire transfer of $15,000 from a holding company based out of Delaware and Silver Hill Properties. This company, as investigators discovered, is a shell operated by Martin Geller Dalton's known business associate. Geller has been previously investigated for real estate fraud and money laundering. The purpose of the payment was listed as emergency dispute settlement. Gasps murmured across the courtroom. Daniel continued, "We believe this payment was a payoff to stage the scene, to cover what happened that night, and most importantly, to create enough confusion to delay police intervention until Craig could shift blame elsewhere." Linda Fay stood sharply. "There's no direct evidence that Mr. Dalton ordered anything." Daniel remained calm. "But there is evidence of intent, of behavior, of pressure applied." Judge Bennett looked over her glasses. "Continue, Mr. Ruiz." Just then, Hazel tugged lightly at Rachel's sleeve. Rachel leaned down. Hazel whispered something. "She wants to show them a new picture," Rachel said softly, eyes darting toward the clerk. "It's in her notebook." The judge gave a slow nod. Hazel walked forward alone, her hands holding a spiral-bound sketch pad. Her legs trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. When she reached the witness bench, she opened to a hung and turned it to the court. It was Moose. Standing taller than he really was, with his body positioned between 2 small girls and a shadowy figure with no face, only jagged limbs. Hazel pointed to the drawing. "That's Moose," she said. "He didn't bark, but he didn't move. He stayed." Daniel approached gently. "Who is this?" he asked, pointing to the dark figure. Hazel hesitated. Then, in the quietest voice, she said, "The man who hurt Mommy." Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. There was no fear in it anymore. Then Ivy stood up from her seat beside Rachel and walked to Moose. She knelt and buried her face in his fur. For a moment, the room thought that would be all. But then she turned to face the judge. "Moose isn't scared," she said clearly. "So I'm not scared either." Even Linda Fay sat back down without a word. After a long pause, Judge Bennett adjusted her microphone and addressed the room. "Let the record show that the child, Ivy Carter, has voluntarily provided verbal testimony. Her statements are to be weighed alongside physical evidence and prior declarations." That was when Daniel opened the final file. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to submit a behavioral analysis report written by Dr. Evelyn Harrow. It states, in summary, that the girls have displayed consistent trauma-based recall. Each of their drawings independently aligns with official crime scene reports: broken furniture, shattered glass, bloodstains, and the absence of defensive wounds on their mother, suggesting she was blindsided rather than engaged in a physical altercation." He took a deep breath. "And in each drawing, in each whispered moment, they've placed Moose. Not because he was there, but because, with him, they remember." The judge asked Rachel to approach. As she did, Ivy whispered something to Moose again. He responded by lowering his head into her lap, tail thumping once. No one in the room doubted they were communicating, even if the language was their own. Rachel unfolded a small piece of paper. "Hazel drew this last night," she explained. She said it was the part of the dream she didn't tell anyone yet. The image showed the same kitchen, but this time Melissa stood between the shadowy figure and her daughters. Her arms were outstretched. Her face, for the first time, had a visible tear. And above her head, a single word written in purple crayon. Stop. That word was more than a plea. It was memory. Moose sat up as if he understood the moment had shifted. Then Daniel spoke again. Ladies and gentlemen, this dog, this therapy companion, has done more than comfort these children. He's allowed them to speak, not because they were forced, but because he made them feel safe enough to remember. Moose is not just an emotional support animal. He is, in every sense, their translator. Judge Bennett looked down at the paper Hazel had drawn. Then she looked at the girls, then at Moose. And then she said, "Let it be entered into the official record." The sky above Montpelier was clear for the first time in days. Sunlight spilled across the stone steps of the courthouse, soft and golden, as if the town itself had been waiting for this moment to exhale. The air still held a chill, but it was the clean, kind fresh, not heavy. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was vastly different from the first days of the trial. Where once there had been murmurs, doubt, and tension, there was now stillness, reverence, and a cautious kind of hope. Hazel and Ivy sat together on the same bench they had occupied throughout the proceedings, but something in their posture had shifted. Ivy leaned back with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm and observant. Hazel's feet swung slightly above the floor, and she whispered something to Ivy that made her sister smile softly. Both wore matching sky-blue dresses and woolen cardigans that Rachel had carefully chosen that morning, knowing that today mattered. Moose lay at their feet, wearing his official therapy dog vest with a new addition, a small silver badge stitched into the strap bearing the seal of the Vermont Judicial Office. Rachel Quinn sat just behind them, her heart beating in rhythm with each word the judge would soon deliver. Her chestnut hair was pinned loosely behind her ears, and her eyes, framed by gentle crow's feet, reflected both exhaustion and peace. These months had aged her in ways she hadn't expected, but they had also deepened her. The former elementary school teacher had become something more than a guardian. She had become a shield, a voice, and sometimes even a translator herself, following in Moose's quiet example. Across the courtroom, Melissa Carter sat upright for the first time in public since the attack. In her early 30s, Melissa was a petite woman with long, dark hair now streaked with gray at the temples. Her movements were still careful, slightly hesitant, as if her body remembered every impact. A faint scar trailed across her left cheek, a reminder of that night. But her eyes, once clouded by confusion and trauma, were clear now. Clearer than they had been in years. She wore a simple lavender blouse and navy skirt, her back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. This was the first time she had been present in court without needing assistance to stand or speak. Beside her sat Dr. Sharon Miles, Melissa's physical therapist. Though small in stature, Sharon had the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of tending to broken bones and silent suffering. She had thick silver hair cropped close and wore a canvas messenger bag stuffed with medical notes and protein bars. Sharon didn't say much. She just squeezed Melissa's hand when needed and watched the girls from a respectful distance. At the front of the room, Judge Marjorie Bennett adjusted the microphone. Her voice was soft, but it carried. "In the case of the State versus Craig Dalton," she began, "this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts, including aggravated assault, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering." There was no outburst, no cries or applause, only stillness, followed by a collective breath that seemed to ripple from the benches, down through the floor. Craig sat at the defense table, his hands clasped, his eyes vacant. The weight of the verdict sank into him slowly. For a man who had once seemed so composed, so controlled, The stillness in his face was now absence. No fight left. The judge continued. Sentencing will proceed under state statute guidelines. However, in light of the unique circumstances surrounding the testimony in this case, the court would like to acknowledge one individual who made that testimony possible. She turned toward Moose. Moose, she said clearly, your presence in this courtroom has provided a channel of communication where language failed. You have allowed 2 children to speak when the weight of their memory was too much to carry alone. For this, the Vermont judiciary hereby recognizes you as an official legal companion for minors in trauma cases, the first designation of its kind in our state. A soft round of applause followed, brief and reverent. Hazel bent forward and whispered something to Moose, who lifted his head and blinked as if he understood. Maybe he did. After the proceedings concluded, the court recessed for the final time. Rachel, standing beside Melissa at the steps, hesitated, then gently reached for her sister's hand. Melissa turned to her, tears welling. I wasn't sure they'd remember me, she whispered. Rachel smiled, her voice breaking slightly. They never forgot. They just needed time to feel safe enough to say so. The doors opened behind them. Hazel and Ivy stepped out, hand in hand. Moose followed, walking calmly, tail wagging, just once. The girls paused at the top of the steps, looking between the 2 women. And then Hazel said, We can all go together now. No one moved for a moment. Then Melissa stepped forward and knelt carefully. Her joints still stiff, her balance tentative. Hazel walked to her and wrapped her arms around her neck. Ivy joined, burying her face into her mother's shoulder. Moose stood just beside them, eyes watchful, as if guarding a boundary between then and now. They remained there for some time. 4 lives shaped by pain, joined again by something stronger. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent behind the hills, they walked through the courthouse square. Melissa held one of Ivy's hands, Rachel the other. Hazel skipped ahead slightly with Moose close beside her, his ears perked at every leaf that fluttered in the wind. They passed a group of school children playing tag near the fountain. Ivy paused to watch. Hazel looked up at Moose and said, I think I'm ready to talk to people, not just you. Moose blinked once and gave a soft huff of air. But, she added with a small smile, you still understand me even if I don't say anything. Rachel overheard and placed a hand gently on Hazel's back. Yes, sweetheart, she said. That's what makes him special. The lesson this story leaves behind is that sometimes justice doesn't come from loud arguments or official documents. It comes from the heart of a child and the steady gaze of a loyal dog. Hazel and Ivy didn't need to shout or explain every detail. They just needed Moose, and someone patient enough to listen to what they couldn't yet say. In our everyday lives, maybe we too need to listen like Moose with presence, with trust, not just with ears. If this story touched you, share it to spread the power of empathy. Hit like to support the channel. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. What do you think made Moose so special in helping the truth come to light? Share your answer in the comments below.